Welcome, friend. For more than 2,000 years, Buddhist teachings have gently guided human beings toward peace, not by forcing the mind into silence, not by fighting against thoughts, but by understanding them. Tonight, we begin a quiet journey together. You don't need to do anything special as you listen. You don't need to fix yourself. You don't need to quiet your mind by force. Simply allow these words to reach you the way soft rain reaches the earth. Let your body rest. Let your breath slow down just a little. The calm you're looking for may be closer than you think. It has been here all along. We live in a world that moves very fast. The pace of life rarely slows and the mind struggles to keep up. It believes that if it thinks hard enough, if it worries thoroughly enough, if it anticipates every possible danger, then it can protect you. And so it never stops. Thoughts arrive uninvited. They rush in the moment you wake up and often follow you into sleep. Plans, memories, regrets, fears, imagined futures, all speaking at once. Even now as you listen, your mind may already be moving. Thoughts may be coming and going without your permission. This is not a failure. This is simply what minds do. Zen Buddhism has been observing this restless movement for over 1,000 years. The ancient teachers gave it a gentle name, the monkey mind. They compared the mind to a monkey swinging from branch to branch, grasping one thought, then immediately reaching for the next. Never settling, always in motion. This is not an insult. It is an honest and compassionate observation. The Buddha himself described the mind as wild, difficult to guard, difficult to control. But he also taught something deeply hopeful. What can be understood does not have to be feared. The problem is not that thoughts appear. The problem begins when we believe we are our thoughts. When we identify so completely with every anxious idea, every fearful image, every critical voice that we forget, there is something else here, too. Something watching. Anxiety often feels deeply personal. It feels like your burden, as if it proves there is something uniquely wrong with you. But Buddhism teaches something very different. It suggests that anxiety is not personal at all. It arises when any human mind becomes caught in certain patterns of thinking and reacting. It is not a sign that you are broken. It is a sign that your mind is doing exactly what it was trained to do. Long ago, this kind of mental vigilance kept our ancestors alive. The mind learned to scan constantly for threats, to imagine danger before it arrived, to stay alert at all times. But the world has changed. The dangers are no longer tigers in the forest. They are emails, expectations, finances, relationships, meaning mortality. The mind still treats them as emergencies. Zen practice does not ask you to silence this mind. That would be like asking the wind not to blow. Instead, it invites you to see the mind clearly, to understand how it works, to notice its patterns without becoming lost inside them. This is where the path begins. Not with fixing, not with solving, but with seeing. For a moment, bring your attention to your breath. You don't need to change it. Just notice it. The breath is happening now, not in the past, not in the future. Each inhale arrives on its own. Each exhale releases itself. Notice how the body knows how to breathe without your effort. Now notice something else. Even as you breathe, thoughts may still be present, planning, judging, wondering if you are doing this right, and yet something in you is aware of those thoughts. That awareness is calm. It is not rushing. It is simply noticing. You are not the movement of the mind. You are what notices the movement. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Zen does not promise a life without problems. It does not offer a permanent state of bliss. What it offers is a different relationship with experience. Thoughts will continue to come. Emotions will continue to rise and fall. Uncertainty will remain part of life. But you can learn not to climb onto every thought like a wild horse. You can learn to watch without being carried away. There's an old Zen saying, you cannot stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. This journey is not about eliminating anxiety. It is about no longer being ruled by it. It is about discovering a quiet place, beneath the noise, a stillness that does not depend on circumstances. You may have touched this stillness before. Perhaps in nature when the world suddenly felt right. Perhaps while holding someone you love when time seemed to pause. Perhaps during deep focus, when the busy mind finally stepped aside. These moments are not accidents. They are glimpses of what is always available. The practice simply helps you return there more often. Tonight, you will hear ancient stories. Stories of monks and merchants, of storms and stillness, of loss, letting go, and quiet strength. You don't need to analyze them. You don't need to remember every detail. Let them work on you in their own way. Like seeds planted gently in the mind. Some will take root quickly, others will wait until the right moment. Nothing is forced here. This is a journey of patience, of returning again and again, of remembering what you already are. So settle in. Let the outside world fade for a while. In the next story, we will begin with a simple image, a small boat drifting in the fog, and through it, we will explore how much of our suffering comes not from what happens, but from the stories we tell about what happens. For now, rest with this breath. You are here, and that is enough. It began on a misty morning, quiet and gray, when the world still felt half asleep. A man rowed a small wooden boat across the river, just as dawn was breaking. The water was calm. The cool air clung to his skin, and the fog hovered so thick that even the far shore had vanished. But the man didn't mind. He had rowed this crossing many times. He knew it well. The rhythm of Azor's creek dip-pull echoed softly like a lullaby only the river could hear. The man's breathing matched the movement. His mind for once was still. There were no thoughts of yesterday's arguments or tomorrow's responsibilities. Just the soft slap of water and the way his boat glided over the surface like a leaf. This, he thought, is peace. And then from within the fog, a shape began to form. Another boat. It was headed straight toward him. At first, he assumed the other boatmen couldn't see him through the mist. So he called out, "Hey, you there, watch your course." No reply. The other boat didn't slow. He waved both arms, his voice louder now. "Move, we're going to crash. Still nothing." He turned the oars, trying to maneuver away, but it was too late. The other boat came fast, striking his side with a heavy thud. The jolt knocked him sideways. The boat rocked wildly. His heart pounded in his chest. Instantly, rage filled him. His peaceful morning shattered in an instant. His face flushed with heat, jaw clenched. How could someone be so careless, so disrespectful? He reached out, furious, ready to shout at whoever was inside. He was already rehearsing the words in his mind, bitter accusing, sharp. But when he looked into the other boat, he froze. There was no one inside. The boat was empty. An old weather-worn vessel, untied from its mooring, had simply drifted downstream. carried by the current and the wind. No one had been steering it. No one had meant to cause harm. He stood there, gripping the edge of the boat, breathing hard. But something inside him began to shift. His anger, which moments before had felt entirely justified, now had nowhere to go. There was no target, no enemy, just wood, just water, just the movement of the river. And without someone to blame, the anger dissolved. Just like that. He let go of the boat's side. He sat down again. The empty vessel continued its slow, aimless journey through the fog. He watched it disappear into the mist. He picked up his oars, but something inside him had changed. That evening, back in his village, he went to the market. It was loud and full of color voices, calling prices, baskets overflowing with fruit and vegetables, children darting between stalls. He handed a few coins to a merchant for a bundle of bananas. The price was higher than usual. He felt his chest tighten. "I think you've overcharged me," he said sharply. "These aren't worth that much." The merchant didn't argue, just looked at him with tired eyes. Deep lines creased his face. There was something hollow behind the eyes. Not cruelty, not greed, just fatigue. The man looked more closely. He noticed the man's hands were shaking slightly. There was a boy, standing nearby barefoot, watching anxiously. Perhaps his son. Perhaps they hadn't sold enough that day. Perhaps the price wasn't about deception, but desperation. The anger was still there, but something in him paused. He remembered the empty boat. What if this merchant wasn't trying to cheat him? What if the high price wasn't aimed at him at all? What if this moment had nothing to do with personal offense and everything to do with hidden struggles he couldn't see? The man exhaled. A long breath. He placed the bananas in his basket. "Thank you," he said. "Have a good evening." The merchant looked surprised. Then he nodded almost shyly. As the man walked away, he felt lighter. The transaction hadn't changed. The price hadn't changed. But something within him had. For years afterward, whenever he felt anger rise, he asked himself a simple question. Is this an empty boat? More often than not, the answer was yes. Not because people never wronged him, but because he saw that much of his suffering came not from the event itself, but from the story he added to it. He learned to pause, to look again, to wonder whether what seemed like a personal attack was just something drifting down the river with no one steering, no one meaning harm. And in that pause, he found peace. Not silence, not perfection, but space. And sometimes that space was all he needed. The man returned home that evening carrying the memory of the empty boat with him. The fog had lifted the river now, calm and clear. But something inside him remained quietly stirred. He walked slowly through the village, his thoughts no longer caught in anger but in reflection. The image of the abandoned boat drifting silently in the mist played over and over in his mind. It had struck him with force, not just physically, but as a teaching, a lesson he had not expected yet, could not ignore. The next day he walked to the market just before noon. The sun was high and the streets were full of voices. Children ran between the stalls. Chickens scratched the dusty corners. The scent of ripe fruit hung thick in the air. He stopped by a familiar vendor, an old man with wrinkled hands and tired eyes. The man asked the price for a bundle of bananas. 20 coins, the vendor said. The man blinked. 20. That's twice what you asked last week. There was a pause. The market's noise seemed to recede. His chest tightened again, as it often did in moments like this. The familiar heat of indignation started to rise along with the old reflex, the need to defend, to correct, to make things fair. A part of him wanted to challenge the price, to raise his voice, to demand an explanation. But before he spoke, something shifted. A question surfaced in his mind.
Is this another empty boat?
He looked more closely at the vendor. The old man's shirt was faded and patched. His shoulders slumped slightly. Behind him stood a thin boy, maybe 10, watching everything in silence. The boy's clothes were too small, and he held a basket with only a few bruised vegetables inside. There was no malice in the vendor's face, only fatigue. Perhaps it wasn't greed. Perhaps it was survival. The man took a long breath. His shoulders dropped. The heat in his chest cooled. "No problem," he said quietly. "I'll take them." He placed the coins gently into the old man's hand, picked up the bananas, and turned to go. As he walked away, he heard the vendor murmur, "Thank you, friend. May your day be kind to you." The words stayed with him. Later, as he sat beneath a tree peeling one of the bananas, he thought again about the boat. How quickly we reach for stories. Someone is trying to cheat me. Someone is being reckless. Someone is to blame. How ready we are to fill the silence with our judgments. But how often are we wrong? How often are the boats empty? It became a kind of meditation for him. Each time he felt himself tensing when someone interrupted, when a cart blocked the road, when a neighbor gossiped, he would ask, "Is this truly aimed at me? Or is it just a drifting vessel shaped by forces beyond anyone's control?" And in asking, he found space. Not always silence, not always ease, but space. And in that space, something softer could grow. Not all boats are empty. Some carry intention, some carry harm, but many, perhaps most, do not. They are simply moving through the current, caught in winds no one chose. He began to meet life differently. The world he found became no less chaotic. The fog still rolled in. Boats still collided. People still raised their voices. But inside him, there was now a place the world could not shake. Not because it was walled off, but because it was open. A wide, still river, where boats could come and go without disturbance. And so he lived with a new kind of awareness, not avoiding life's impact, but softening in the face of it. Not clinging to control, but loosening his grip. He learned to see, and in seeing, he was free. The lesson of the empty boat stayed with him like a quiet companion in the background of his daily life. It didn't erase frustration, nor did it grant him sudden enlightenment, but it gave him something else, something far more powerful. A pause. That pause, however small, allowed a different choice to emerge. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and golden over the fields, he walked along a narrow road that wound past the homes of his neighbors. He carried a sack of grain over one shoulder, heading toward the mill. As he turned a corner, a boy on a bicycle sped past him, kicking up a cloud of dust and nearly knocking the bag from his grasp. "Watch where you're going," he shouted instinctively, the old reflex flickering back to life. The boy was already far down the road, unaware, laughing with friends. He stood still for a moment. The dust settled. The sack was fine. Nothing had happened, not really. His pulse, which had leapt in anger, began to slow. And then, quietly, "Is this an empty boat?" He smiled to himself. It was becoming a habit, this gentle inquiry. He shook his head, not in frustration, but in recognition. Even the mind's reactivity, he now saw, could be met with kindness. That evening, sitting on the steps of his home, He watched the wind move through the grass. The rice fields shimmered in waves. Children's voices drifted from nearby courtyards. Somewhere in the distance, a flute was playing soft and slow. He thought about the way his life had changed, not dramatically. Not in outward appearance, but in the way he experienced things. Before, his days were filled with battles, correcting what felt wrong, proving himself right, defending his pride. Each slight, each delay, each unexpected change had been a challenge to overcome, a wrong to be answered. He had lived like a soldier, at war with the world. But now there was a stillness, not always and not perfectly, but often enough to feel real, and that stillness had opened something he hadn't expected: tenderness. He began to notice suffering more easily. Not just his own, but others. The hunched shoulders of a neighbor, the tired look in a mother's eyes, the way a shopkeeper's smile didn't quite reach his face. He realized that most people like him were just trying to get by. Most were rowing boats through fog colliding, not out of cruelty, but out of blindness. And so more often than not, he let go. He let the boats drift past. There were still moments when anger caught him off guard. He was not a saint, but when it did, he would breathe. He would ask the question. And even when the answer wasn't clear, the act of asking softened him. Years later, a young man from the village came to him, frustrated and full of fire. He had been insulted by a friend, cheated in a trade, ignored by his elders. "How do you let it all go?" the young man asked. "Don't you ever feel disrespected? Don't you want to stand up for yourself?" The man listened quietly. He did not argue. When the young man had finished, he said, "There is nothing wrong with standing tall, but sometimes the strongest thing you can do is step aside." He paused, then added, "If you spend your life shouting at every boat that bumps into you, you'll have no voice left when it truly matters." The young man frowned. "But how do you know which ones matter?" He smiled gently. "Start by asking if the boat is empty. You'd be surprised how often it is." And that was the heart of it. Not a doctrine, not a rule, just a question, a space. A possibility that maybe not everything was about you. Maybe the world wasn't attacking, maybe it was just moving. And in that simple shift, a life could change. The next morning, the man went down to the river once more. The mist had returned, curling over the water like breath. He stepped into his boat and pushed off oars, gliding silently through the stillness. And somewhere in the fog, a shape began to appear. Another boat. He watched it come closer, slowly, quietly. He did not call out. He did not wave his arms. He simply watched. As it drifted near, he saw again no one inside. Just an old boat floating, guided by the river's will. He smiled and kept rowing. The river of life carries many boats. Some cross our path gently unnoticed. Others collide without warning. And in those moments, we often react with blame, with stories with emotion. But the story of the empty boat reminds us not all impact is personal. Sometimes things simply drift into us, moved by forces no one controls. When we begin to see this, even small moments become doorways to freedom. But not all restlessness comes from the outside. Sometimes the storm is within. There are times when the world is quiet, yet the mind refuses to be still. We lie awake at night, not because of noise, but because of thought, because of fear, because of doubt. What do we do then? To answer that question, we turn now to the next story, a young seeker full of worry who travels far in search of peace, and the Zen teacher who offers him a most unexpected answer. Let us follow him now and listen. He was young. His eyes carried the heavy shine of someone who had thought too much for too long. His steps were fast but unsure, as if he were chasing something that kept slipping just beyond reach. He had walked for many days across forests and mountains, asking for directions to the monastery where the Zen master was said to live. Stories of the old teacher's calm had spread like smoke, how he could listen without speaking, how his silence had more weight than most people's advice. The young man didn't know exactly what he hoped to find, but something in him whispered that he must go. What he wanted was peace. Not a vague idea, but a real thing. Something he could hold or at least feel. A quieting, a softening, a relief from the constant weight of his own thoughts. Because his mind would not stop. From the moment he woke up until long after midnight, his thoughts pulled and tangled like roots beneath the ground. What if I fail? What if they leave me? What if I never figure it out? Even in silence, the questions shouted. Even when he was alone, the voices crowded him. And so he came hoping that the master would give him something, some answer, some technique, some truth to silence the noise. When he arrived, the monastery was smaller than he imagined, tucked in a valley where trees swayed like they were breathing. It was quiet, not in a heavy way, but in a natural way, like the land itself had nothing to prove. He passed under a wooden archway and found the master sitting alone in the garden. The old man was watching an ant climb over a stone. He didn't look up. The young man approached and bowed as he had seen others do. The master gave a small nod but said nothing. The silence stretched. Finally, the young man sat down and exhaled. "Master," he said, "I've come because I can't find peace." Still the master said nothing. The young man hesitated, then continued. "My thoughts never stop. I've tried everything. I sit, I breathe, I read the sutras, I've fasted, I've walked, I've stayed up all night chanting. But it's like, my mind has a mind of its own." The master raised one eyebrow. "And what have you tried to do with your thoughts?" The young man sighed. "I've tried to push them away, to stop them, to quiet them. I've argued with them, challenged them, ignored them, but they come back stronger. Louder." The master was quiet again. Then he said, "Bring me one." The young man blinked. "What? Bring me one of your thoughts. Set it here on this rock. Let me see it." The young man opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. The master waited. "You can't," the old man said gently. "You cannot bring me a thought. You can't pick it up. You can't touch it. You can't hand it to me." He leaned forward. "And yet you believe it owns you." The young man looked down. The master continued. "A thought arises. It floats, it fades. Like mist on the morning grass. It only stays if you chase it." Then he picked up a small leaf from the ground and held it out. "This is real," he said. "This I can hand to you. But your thoughts, they come and go like birds. You don't need to cage them. You only need to watch them fly." The young man sat very still. For the first time in weeks, maybe longer, he didn't feel the urge to say anything. He simply listened to the wind, to the birds, to the way his own breath rose and fell without asking. He didn't understand everything the master had said, but he felt something loosen inside. He didn't need to hold every thought. He didn't need to fix them or win over them. He could watch. He could allow. He could be more than the voice in his head. And that perhaps was the beginning of peace. That night the hung man stayed at the monastery. The master had offered him a place in the guest quarters, a small wooden room with no door, only a curtain swaying in the wind. The space was bare a mat for sleeping, a folded blanket, and a candle whose flame flickered even when there was no breeze. He lay awake for a while, not out of restlessness, but from a strange, unfamiliar quiet. His thoughts still came, but they seemed softer now, as if reluctant to intrude. They passed through like visitors, and for once he didn't feel the need to greet each one. At dawn, the temple bell rang, a low, deep sound like the earth breathing. He rose and followed the others to the garden where the master was already sweeping fallen leaves. The young man stood beside him in silence for a while, unsure if he should speak. Eventually, he said, "I think I'm beginning to understand what you said yesterday. But it's hard. Some thoughts, they're so loud, they feel real." The master stopped sweeping. He turned to the young man and asked, "Do you know how to tell whether a bell is empty?" The young man shook his head. "You strike it," the master said. "If it sings, it is hollow." He held the broom like a staff. The mind is not so different. When something strikes it, a memory, a fear, a regret, it rings. The louder the sound, the more empty it often is. The young man frowned. But what if the thought is true? What if the fear is valid? The master smiled. Many fears are valid, but truth and noise are not the same. A tiger is true, but imagining it pacing your bedroom at night is noise. He pointed to the bamboo grove nearby. See those stalks? When the wind moves through them, they rattle. They don't ask why. They don't try to stop the wind. They simply bend and return. The young man followed his gaze. The bamboo swayed gently. No resistance, no fear. The master turned back to sweeping. "You want peace," he said, "but you seek it by wrestling with ghosts. Let them pass. When you stop chasing, the mind finds its own balance." They swept together in silence for a while, the sound of bristles against stone, the only conversation. Later, the young man helped with breakfast. He washed rice, listening to the way the grains clicked against the bowl. He stirred the pot, slowly noticing the swirl of steam, rising and disappearing. He set the table, aware of the cool surface of the bowls, the weight of the wooden spoons. Something in him had changed. He was not doing anything differently, but he was seeing differently. The thoughts still came, some anxious, some doubtful, some familiar like old songs, but he no longer felt the urge to follow them. They were just sounds, like wind, like bamboo, like birds calling across the hills. And beneath them all, he noticed something else. A quiet that didn't depend on silence. A calm that didn't require stillness. It was there even in movement, even in thought, even in him. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the stones, he sat again beside the master. I used to believe he said that I had to fight my thoughts, that peace would only come when I had conquered them. The master nodded. Many believe that, but now I see. He paused. The thoughts aren't the problem. It's the believing, the attaching, the identifying. Yes, the master said softly. A thought is a cloud. You are the sky. The young man closed his eyes, and for the first time he believed that might be true. The next morning, the young man prepared to leave. He had stayed longer than he planned, not because he was given instructions or teachings in any formal way. but because something had begun to settle inside him, like dust falling gently to the ground after a long windstorm. The urgency that had once pushed him forward now felt quiet. The questions still existed, but they no longer screamed. They whispered, and sometimes they didn't speak at all. Before departing, he returned to the garden where the master was again watching ants move across the stone path. He bowed. "Thank you, master," he said, "for showing me something I couldn't see." The master smiled faintly. "I didn't show you. You stopped looking long enough to notice." The young man nodded. "I still have thoughts," he said. "They still come, sometimes strongly, sometimes with fear. They will always come," the master replied. "Peace is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of grasping." He leaned down and traced a circle in the dirt with the end of his cane. "When you are caught in thought, you are here." He pointed to the edge. "When you observe thought, you are here." He pointed to the center. The young man studied the circle. "And when I forget again," the master looked up at the sky, "then you remember again. No judgment, no disappointment, only truth. You forget, you remember, you return. That is the practice." On the path back down the mountain, the young man walked slowly. The trail was the same, but his eyes were different. He heard birds he hadn't noticed on the way up. He smelled the sharp scent of pine. He felt the earth steady beneath his feet. A thought came. What if this doesn't last? Then another. What if I lose this feeling? He paused. He smiled, and he let the thoughts go. Somewhere deep within him, a voice not of panic but of kindness rose. Let it come. Let it go. Let it be. By the time he reached the base of the hill, he no longer needed to hold on to the experience. He didn't have to preserve it, explain it, or prove it had happened. It had entered him like morning light through a window without force. And even if clouds came tomorrow, he now knew the sun was still there, waiting, always. He continued walking, not in search, not in escape, but simply walking, simply breathing. And with each step, he returned not to a destination, but to himself. The young man descended the mountain, but something within him had risen. Not confidence, not certainty, but clarity. A quiet knowing that he no longer had to chase peace like a distant prize. It was already here whenever he remembered to look. And so, his journey continued. Not with questions, but with awareness. And that awareness, like a candle in the dark, would light the path through many storms to come. Because even when we see clearly, life does not always stay gentle. There are days when anger still visits, when injustice presses hard, when our patience wears thin. What do we do then? In the next story, we meet a teacher. Not through his lectures, but through the way he walks the market, speaks with a stranger, and handles conflict. Sometimes it is not what we say, but what we are that teaches best. Let us walk beside him now and watch. In a village nestled between green hills and golden rice fields, there lived a Zen teacher. He was not famous, not the subject of grand stories or glowing titles. Most people simply called him the old man with quiet feet, because even when he walked through the busiest parts of town, his steps made no sound. He did not preach in temples. He did not gather students in rows. He simply lived, and in the way he lived, he taught. Every morning, just after sunrise, he would walk to the market carrying a small woven basket. His robe was plain, his face weathered. He walked slowly with attention, as if each step mattered. and to him it did. The market was full of life merchants, shouting prices, children weaving between stalls, chickens darting across the dusty paths. But the teacher never seemed in a hurry. He would stop to admire the curve of a ripe melon, to ask a vendor how her mother's health was, to watch a bird peck at crumbs beneath a table. People greeted him kindly. Some offered him extra fruit. Others simply smiled. He rarely said much, but his presence was like shade on a hot day, quiet, comforting, and always noticed after it passed. One morning, something different happened. He approached a vendor selling bowls. The man behind the table was young, sharp-eyed, impatient. He watched the teacher handle one of the bowls, turning it gently in his hands. "That one is 25 coins, the vendor said. The teacher nodded, examining the glaze, running his fingers along the rim. 25, the vendor repeated, louder this time. "It's not cheap." The teacher smiled softly, returned the bowl to the table, and reached into his robe for a pouch. Before he could count the coins, another man, bigger, rougher, stepped between them. "I was here first," the man barked. "That bowl is mine." The vendor looked uncertain. The teacher stepped back. "You weren't even looking at it," the vendor muttered. "I want it now," the man growled. "Sell it to me." The air shifted. Shoppers nearby slowed their movements, pretending not to listen while clearly watching. A moment like this could easily catch fire. The teacher looked at the bowl, then at the man. His face didn't change. No anger, no resistance, only quiet attention. Then he nodded. "Of course," he said. He stepped aside. The man snatched the bowl, tossed a handful of coins at the vendor, and stalked off. The vendor's shoulders slumped. He turned to the teacher, shame in his eyes. "I'm sorry, master. That wasn't right." The teacher smiled. "Nothing was lost. But he disrespected you. He stole your turn. He stole nothing. I gave it freely." The vendor looked confused. "Why would you let someone like that win?" The teacher's smile softened. There was no victory. Only a bowl and a man who believes the world owes him something. If I had argued, I would have fed that belief. If I had insisted, I would have joined his suffering. He placed a few coins on the table. "I'll return tomorrow. Perhaps another bowl will be waiting." Then he turned and continued through the market, walking as if nothing had happened, slow, steady, with quiet feet. That evening, the vendor sat alone, thinking of the moment. He realized the teacher had left him not just with words, but with a kind of imprint, a model for how to meet fire with water, noise with silence. And he wondered, how often had he added fuel to flames, mistaken pride for strength? He didn't have an answer. But he knew that the next time anger rose, he would remember the old man's footsteps. And maybe, just maybe, he too would choose to walk away. The next morning, the old teacher returned to the market just as the sun broke through the mist. His pace was unchanged, his basket still empty. If he remembered the incident from the day before, he gave no sign of it. He paused to greet the fishmonger, whose hands were already slick with the day's first catch. He bowed to an old woman sweeping her doorway. He knelt to pet a dog lounging lazily in the sun. When he reached the pottery stall, the vendor was waiting, not just with goods, but with eyes that carried something different. Thoughtfulness, perhaps, a quiet hope. "I saved a bowl for you," the vendor said. The teacher smiled. "Thank you." He picked it up, turning it slowly. It wasn't the finest in the stall, but its shape was pleasing, its surface slightly uneven, caught the light in a way that made the teacher pause. "Beautiful," he said. He placed the right number of coins on the table. As he reached for his basket, a voice rang out again. It was the same man from the day before. This time he was holding a different bowl, shouting at a child who had bumped his arm. "Stupid brat," he snapped. "Look what you almost made me drop." The boy backed away, eyes wide. Before anyone could intervene, the old teacher walked calmly to the man's side. Not confrontational, not scolding, simply present. "Is the bowl unharmed?" he asked. The man blinked. "Yes." "And the child?" "What?" The teacher looked at the boy. "Are you hurt?" The boy shook his head, barely breathing. The teacher turned back to the man. "Then no harm has come." The man scowled, puffed his chest. "Ha, that's not the point." The teacher didn't respond with logic or defense. Instead, he looked at the bowl in the man's hand. "May I see it?" Surprised, the man handed it over. The teacher examined it carefully, then cradled it in both hands. "It's lovely," he said. "But if it were to break, what would remain?" The man snorted. "Nothing," the teacher smiled. "That's not true. The clay remains, the earth remains, the memory of it remains. But the bowl is only a shape for a while." He handed it back gently. The man stood frozen, unsure how to respond. The teacher bowed slightly. "Be kind while the shape holds." Then he turned and walked away. No one spoke for a moment. The market felt quieter somehow, softer. The boy looked up at the man who had shouted, then darted off into the crowd. The man stood alone. Later, the vendor found the teacher sitting beneath a tree just beyond the edge of the market. He offered him a cup of tea. "Thank you," the teacher said, accepting it with both hands. "I've never seen someone calm another person without saying anything harsh," the vendor said. The teacher sipped his tea. "You didn't shame him. You didn't resist him. And yet, something changed." The teacher nodded. "Sometimes the best way to hold water is with open hands." The vendor sat beside him. "I used to think teaching meant talking," he said. "But now I see it's more about being." The teacher smiled, setting his cup down. "Exactly." And together they sat in silence, watching the world move gently around them. Weeks passed. The market pulsed as always, alive with chatter footsteps, laughter, the rustle of cloth, and clink of coins. But something subtle had shifted. A gentler tone had woven itself into the rhythm of the place. Fewer arguments flared. More smiles lingered. It was as if the presence of the quiet teacher had settled into the soil. He still came each morning, still walked slowly, still touched each interaction like a bell softly, but in a way that left a long ringing silence behind. One morning, a student from a distant town arrived in search of the teacher. She had heard stories that he could calm the fiercest tempers, that he could silence inner storms without a single chant or mantra. She approached him in the garden behind the market, where he was trimming herbs beside a crumbling stone wall. "Master," she said, bowing low, "I've come to learn from you." He looked up with a kind expression. "Then watch." She blinked. Watch what he handed her, a sprig of mint. "Start here." Confused but respectful, she followed him as he moved through the day. He bought fruit, pausing to ask the seller about his daughter's illness. He helped an old man tie a bundle of firewood. He stepped aside on a narrow path so a mother with 2 children could pass first. He didn't explain anything. He simply moved with presence. After several hours, the student stopped him. I don't mean to question, Master, but I had hoped for something more. Direct, a method, a practice. He turned to face her fully. What have you seen so far? She hesitated. You are gentle. He waited. You listen more than you speak. Still waiting. You respond, not react. A long pause. You treat every person like they matter. He smiled. She blinked, realizing. Oh, she whispered. That's the practice. The teacher nodded. Peace is not a place you visit once you've solved all your problems. It's how you meet each moment, even the difficult ones. He led her to a bench. They sat together beneath a flowering tree. Most people seek control, he said. Control of others, of the future, of the mind, but control is not freedom. Presence is. The wind stirred the blossoms. A few petals drifted down, resting in the folds of the student's robe. She watched them land. For once, she didn't try to hold on to the insight. She didn't try to name it, capture it, or even remember it. She simply let it settle the way the petals had. They sat like that for a long while, saying nothing, needing nothing. Eventually, the teacher stood. Come, he said, it's time for tea. And as they walked back through the winding garden paths, she understood why his footsteps made no sound. It was not magic. It was because he carried no weight. No pride, no resistance, no need to be more than he was. And that she saw now was why people listened even when he said nothing, because some truths are not taught, they are lived. Not all teachers speak from a mountaintop. Some simply walk among us with quiet feet, gentle hands, and eyes that see clearly. They do not command attention. They offer presence. And in that presence, something in us softens, listens, remembers. But life does not always give us calm roads and soft-spoken guides. Sometimes it gives us trials that pull us under, losses that feel unbearable, moments when silence is not peaceful but hollow. How do we continue then? Our next story leads us into that space. It begins not in peace but in grief. A man has lost everything, and yet what unfolds is not a story of despair but of unexpected compassion and the power of one moment to change the course of a life. Let us follow him now into the stillness that sorrow sometimes leaves behind. The rains had ended, but the air still carried their weight. Puddles dotted the dirt paths, reflecting a sky too pale to be called blue. Along one such path walked a man, barefoot, clothes clinging to his thin frame. His face was drawn not from hunger but from something deeper, an emptiness that no food could fill. He had once been a father. He had once been a husband. Now he was neither. The illness had come quickly, quietly, like a thief in the night. First his daughter, then his wife. He buried them both within the same week, 2 mounds beneath a tree whose blossoms had not yet opened. The village mourned with him, but soon life moved on. Markets reopened, fields were tilled, laughter returned to courtyards, but not to him. He left the village the following morning, taking nothing but a walking stick and the silence that had wrapped itself around his heart. He wandered without direction. Days blurred into one another. He avoided towns, slept beneath trees, and spoke to no one. What use was there in words when the people he loved could no longer hear them? He had no prayer left to offer, only questions. Why them? Why now? Why at all? One afternoon he came upon a small riverside shrine. It was old, nearly swallowed by moss and vines. A bell hung above the doorway, rusted but intact. Beside it sat an old monk, cross-legged, eyes closed, breathing as if each inhale belonged to the earth and not just his lungs. The man stood at a distance, unsure why he had stopped. Perhaps it was the stillness, not just in the monk's body, but in the air around him. It was not the stillness of death. He knew that kind too well. No, this was different. This was alive, present, unmoving, yet not frozen. The monk opened one eye. "You've come far," he said, voice as soft as wind through dry grass. The man didn't answer. The monk patted the space beside him. "Sit." He didn't move. The monk said nothing more. He simply turned his gaze back to the river. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Eventually, the man stepped forward and sat down. Not because he understood, not because he trusted, but because he was tired. They sat in silence. Birds called from the trees. A fish jumped in the river. The sun moved slowly across the sky. Finally, the man spoke. His voice cracked. "I've lost everything." The monk nodded. "I have no reason left to live." Another nod. "I don't know what I'm doing here." The monk looked at him now directly. His eyes were neither warm nor cold. They were clear, as if they could see not only the pain but the space beyond it. "You're here because even in your sorrow, something is still watching," the monk said. "Something in you has not left." The man frowned. "I don't feel it." "You don't need to feel it," the monk replied. "You only need to notice that even now you are aware of what you feel." The man turned to the river. The monk continued. "When the heart breaks, it opens. What you do with that opening. That is the path." The man shook his head. "I don't want a path. I want them back." The monk placed a hand on the earth. "Of course you do. Love always wants to hold. But love can also release." They sat together as the sky turned amber. No great wisdom was exchanged. No answers were given. Only presence, only breath. And sometimes that is enough. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the river caught its last glimmers like fading memories on glass. The man and the monk remained in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. It didn't demand to be filled. It simply stretched between them like a thread, thin but unbroken. "I don't want to feel this," the man finally said. His voice was low, hollow. "It's too much." The monk didn't look away from the river. "It is." The man's throat tightened. Then why let it stay? Because it's already here. A long pause. Pushing it away, the monk continued, is like pushing against the tide. You exhaust yourself, and still the water returns. The man looked down at his hands, callous, trembling slightly. "I don't know how to grieve." "No one does," the monk said. "Grief is not a skill, it is a crossing. Each must walk it their own way." The man asked, "And if I never reach the other side?" The monk turned to him now. "Then sit on the shore, watch the water. Let it speak to you, but it only speaks in pain," the man whispered. "At first," the monk said, "but listen long enough and pain becomes something else." "What love," he said. Unspent, the man felt something catch in his chest. Not a breath, not a sob, just stillness, heavy and strange. The monk stood slowly, brushing dirt from his robe. "Come," he said. "Let's eat." They entered the small shrine. Inside, everything was spare: a single mat, a wooden bowl, a lamp, a kettle. The monk lit the lamp, poured hot water over tea leaves, and handed the man a bowl. They sat again. The tea was simple, earthy, warm. The man held the bowl close. "This is all I have now," he said. The monk smiled. "For this moment it is enough." And for a breath, the man believed him. He drank slowly. He tasted every sip. Later that night he lay beneath the stars, wrapped in a borrowed blanket. He didn't sleep, but he didn't tremble either. The grief was still there. It pressed against his ribs, it ached in his throat. But so did something else. Something quieter, something like space. He remembered what the monk had said, when the heart breaks it opens, and in that opening something new might enter. Not to replace what was lost, but to keep it company. The days that followed did not heal him, not in the way people often hope healing will come. There was no moment of bright revelation, no sudden lifting of sorrow, but there was a rhythm, and within that rhythm, something began to change. Each morning the monk would rise before the sun and sweep the leaves from the shrine's stone steps. The man began rising with him not out of obligation, but out of quiet agreement. He would take the broom after the monk and finish what was left behind. Later, they would boil water, drink tea, sit. They spoke little. Sometimes the monk would point to a flower and say, "Look how it opens," without asking why. Or he would gesture to the river and say, "Notice how it carries even the fallen branch gently." The man rarely responded, but he listened, not just to the words, but to the silences between them. He still cried some nights. He still woke with the ache of absence, but he no longer feared the grief. One evening, they sat by the riverbank again, watching dusk settle like ash over the treetops. The monk spoke softly. "Do you still feel broken?" The man thought for a while, then nodded. "Yes," he said, "but I'm no longer trying to be whole." The monk smiled. "Good. Wholeness is a story. Openness is real." They sat with that. And then, without ceremony, the monk said, "Tomorrow you should return to your village." The man blinked. "Why?" "Because grief, when softened, becomes compassion, and compassion has work to do." The man looked at the river. "I'm not ready." "No one is," said the monk. "Go anyway." He didn't sleep much that night. But when dawn came, he packed the small blanket, bowed deeply to the shrine, and began walking. Not with certainty, not with peace, but with presence, with a heart that still ached but no longer closed. He passed the tree where he had buried them. He knelt, he wept. Then he sat for a long while, hand on the soil. There were no words, only breath, only memory, and the faint, unwavering pulse of love that grief had not taken, only revealed. He stood, and as he walked toward the village once more, he understood what the monk had meant. Grief had not left him, but it had changed its shape. It had become something he could carry, not as a wound, but as a prayer. Some pains do not disappear. They do not resolve. They become part of us, softened by time, shaped by presence, and carried not as burdens, but as reminders of how deeply we've loved. Grief, too, has its own quiet wisdom, and when we stop resisting it, it often gives us a gift, a heart more open, more tender, more ready to see others clearly. Because the world is full of invisible weight, and sometimes what another person needs is not our opinion, but our silence, not our solution, but our stillness. In the next story, we meet two monks, one wise, one learning, walking through the world with bare feet and full attention. And in a single muddy moment, a lesson arises that will echo far beyond the road they walk. Let us walk with them now. Two monks walked side by side along a narrow country path, their robes brushing softly against tall grass that swayed in the morning breeze. One was old, with a calm gaze and a back curved from years of bowing to the earth. The other was young, sharp in movement, his mind still filled with questions and edges. They walked in silence, as was their way. The rain had ended only hours earlier, and the path was slick with mud. Puddles reflected the gray sky. Frogs croaked in the ditches. Occasionally, the older monk would pause to observe a leaf or place a fallen branch gently to the side. The younger followed, trying to mimic his composure but struggling inwardly with impatience. Not far ahead, they came upon a river crossing. The water wasn't deep, but it had swelled with rain, turning the stepping stones slippery and uneven. Standing at the edge was a woman in fine robes, clearly not dressed for travel. Her sleeves were embroidered, her sandals delicate. She stood motionless, brows furrowed, staring at the muddy path before her with frustration. As the monks approached, the woman looked up sharply. Her expression was cold. "Help me cross," she said, not as a request but as a command. The young monk recoiled slightly. He had been trained to avoid contact with women, especially one of such status. Her tone struck him as entitled, her posture stiff with pride. But before he could say anything, the older monk stepped forward. Without hesitation, he bowed slightly, then lifted the woman in his arms. Carefully, wordlessly, he carried her across the mud and set her gently down on the other side. She gave no thanks. She turned and walked away without a glance. The younger monk's jaw tightened. They continued walking. Hours passed. The path narrowed, then widened, then disappeared into dry fields and appeared again near a bamboo grove. Still, the older monk said nothing about what had happened. His steps were as steady as before, his breath, even his eyes soft. But the younger monk could no longer contain himself. "How could you do that?" he burst out. "You know we are not supposed to touch women. Especially one like her. She didn't even thank you." She looked down on us. "And yet, you carried her." The older monk stopped. He turned slowly, his face calm. "I put her down hours ago," he said. "Why are you still carrying her?" The words fell into the space between them, like a stone into still water. The younger monk opened his mouth, then closed it. In that moment, he realized he had been dragging her in his mind the entire time. While the older monk had returned to walking, to breathing, to being, he had been locked in judgment and story. He had believed himself pure by avoiding her. Yet he had carried her farther than his teacher ever had. They stood in silence. And then the younger monk bowed, not out of obedience, but out of recognition of how heavy our thoughts can become when we mistake them for truth. They resumed their walk, but something in the younger monk had shifted. His steps were slower now, not out of weariness, but humility. The silence between them was no longer filled with frustration. It had become something softer, a space for reflection. After a while, he spoke again, this time gently. "I thought I was being disciplined," he said, "but really I was just being proud." The elder monk offered no correction, only silence, which somehow felt like agreement. The younger continued, "All this time I thought avoiding the woman made me virtuous, but my mind wouldn't let her go. I judged her, I judged you, and all while telling myself I was detached." They stopped at a small stream, where the elder monk knelt to wash his hands. She was suffering too, the older man said, wringing water from his sleeves. "Did you see it?" The younger monk thought back. He had seen only arrogance, sharpness, impatience. But now, looking again with memory, he noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands had trembled slightly as she stared at the mud. She had not been rude for its own sake. She had been frayed, or overwhelmed, or simply unused to needing help. No, he admitted. I didn't. The elder monk nodded. We often miss the suffering of others when our own ego is loud. They walked again. The path curved through bamboo and rice fields. Birds fluttered in and out of the reeds. The air was damp but fragrant with new growth. Eventually, they passed a farmer struggling to lift a broken cart wheel. The elder monk stepped forward without hesitation, bending to help. The younger followed suit, and together they pushed the cart upright. The farmer bowed deeply, eyes shining. Blessings on both of you. As they walked away, the younger monk felt lightness in his chest. Master, he said softly, how do you let go so easily of judgment, of resentment? The elder smiled. Because I've seen how heavy they are. They came to a tree and sat beneath it. The sun had begun to lower, casting long shadows across the field. The elder monk picked up a leaf and held it between his fingers. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting, he said. It means not clinging, not carrying more than the moment asks of you. He dropped the leaf and they both watched it drift to the ground. The younger monk closed his eyes. He saw himself standing at the river again. He saw the woman's face, not just its sternness, but its fear. He saw the old monk lifting her, not to make a point, not to be noble, but simply because she needed to cross. He opened his eyes. I think he said, I've been trying to follow rules more than follow the heart of them. The elder monk smiled. That is the beginning of wisdom. And in the stillness beneath that tree, the younger monk realized something important. The path is not clean, it is muddy, and sometimes to walk it with grace, you must be willing to get your feet dirty. They spent the night beneath that tree. The elder monk slept soundly, wrapped loosely in his robe. The younger monk lay awake, eyes tracing the branches above, thoughts drifting like wind-blown leaves. He wasn't unsettled, just honest. He had spent years believing that practice meant control, that purity came from distance, that the path was a ladder to climb, rung by rung towards something called perfection. But now he wasn't so sure. The elder had broken the rule, at least the rule as the younger monk understood it. And yet there had been no arrogance in his act, no righteousness. Only clarity, only kindness. It wasn't defiance, it was freedom. Not the kind of freedom that demands to be noticed, but the kind that moves quietly, like water flowing around stone. At dawn, they resumed their journey. The sky blushed with morning light. Mist clung to the fields and the road was empty, save for their footsteps. After some time, the younger monk spoke. Master, I think I understand why you carried her. The elder monk raised an eyebrow, inviting him to go on. You saw what was needed, the younger said, and you responded not from rule, not from fear, but from compassion. The elder monk gave a slight nod. When the heart is clear, action becomes simple. But I still wonder, the younger added. What if someone misunderstood? What if they judged you? The elder chuckled softly. Many did, some still do, and that doesn't bother you. The elder monk paused at the edge of a field, watching wind move through tall stalks of grain. When you stop carrying your own judgments, he said, the judgments of others weigh less too. They continued walking. In the distance, a small village came into view. The younger monk felt different now, not because he had reached enlightenment, but because he had stepped closer to something truer. not in theory but in living. Before he had tried to be good. Now he wanted to be real. Before he had tried to be untouched. Now he saw the beauty of touching life fully and letting it touch him in return. They entered the village and were met with curious eyes. Some people bowed, some looked away. One man muttered, "That's the monk who broke the rule." The elder monk smiled and bowed. The younger monk watched closely, not a flicker of defensiveness. No need to explain, only presence. He smiled too, because he finally understood. Sometimes the most disciplined heart is the one willing to bend, and the cleanest hands are those that have touched the world with love. The mind often clings to rules, believing they will keep us safe. But wisdom does not grow from rigidity. It blossoms in the space where compassion meets clarity, where the heart sees beyond appearance and responds to what is truly needed. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking what we thought was sacred, not out of rebellion but out of love. As the younger monk discovered, letting go of judgment can be its own form of liberation. But not all chains are forged from pride. Some are made of fear, of habits too old to name, of stories we carry about who we are and who we're allowed to become. In our next story, a student wrestles with one of the most difficult practices of all, accepting himself. Let us sit beside him now in the quiet room where his thoughts rise like shadows, and watch what happens when he dares to stop running from his own reflection. He sat alone in the meditation hall. The walls were bare, the floor swept clean. Only the low breath of wind against the paper screens reminded him that the world outside still moved. His knees ached, his back protested, his thoughts shouted. He had come to the monastery seeking stillness. Instead, he found himself loud, restless, full of doubt. The first few days had passed in silence and ritual. Bowing, walking, sitting, eating, all without speaking. At first he welcomed it, a break from the noise of the world. But now a different noise had taken over, one no silence could drown, his own mind. "You're not doing it right. Everyone else looks so peaceful. Why can't you just be calm? This was a mistake. You're a mistake." Thoughts like stones thrown into still water, ripples upon ripples until he could no longer see the surface beneath. He tried to sit through it. He tried to breathe through it. But the effort only made it louder. After the morning bell one day, he stayed behind as the others left for work practice. He sat in the back corner of the hall, hands clenched in his lap, shame burning in his chest. The door creaked. Footsteps. It was the teacher. She walked slowly, her robe whispering against the floor, and sat beside him without a word. They sat in silence for several minutes. Then softly, she asked, "What are you running from?" He didn't answer. She turned to face him. "You don't need to tell me, but you need to ask yourself." His throat tightened. "I came here to escape all that," he finally whispered. She nodded. "And now it's sitting beside you." He laughed bitterly. "More like sitting inside me." She didn't flinch. "Have you tried listening to it?" He looked at her confused. To the voice, she said. To the fear, the judgment, not to argue, not to obey, just to hear. He looked down. "I'm afraid of what it might say." She placed her hand gently on the floor. "It's already saying it. The question is, will you let it speak fully, or spend your life trying to shout over it?" Tears came then. Unexpected, unstoppable. He didn't even know why. Or maybe he did. Because all his life he had tried to be better, to be enough, to be quiet. Good, invisible, perfect. And no matter how hard he tried, the voice inside said it still wasn't enough. The teacher let him cry. When he finally looked up, she was smiling gently. "You don't have to believe the voice," she said. "You just have to stop running from it." He sat with that. It was not peace, not yet, but it was honest. And somehow that was a beginning. In the days that followed, he did not find silence. He found shadows. Old memories surfaced, some soft, some sharp. The face of a parent frowning in disappointment. The sting of a childhood insult that had never quite healed. The silent shame of comparing himself to others, always falling short in his own eyes. He had come to the monastery expecting to leave those things behind. Instead, he met them again one by one in the stillness he had sought. And slowly, he began to realize the silence wasn't making him suffer. It was simply showing him what had always been there. Each morning, he returned to the hall. He sat with legs crossed, spine upright, thoughts spinning, and watched. At first, it felt like failure. He couldn't concentrate. He couldn't clear his mind. He couldn't stop the voice. But then one morning, something subtle changed. The voice still came. "You're no good. You'll never get this right. You don't belong here." But this time, he didn't argue. He didn't resist. He simply listened like the teacher had said. And something happened that surprised him. The voice softened. Not because he silenced it, but because he let it speak. He began to notice that the voice wasn't a monster, it was a frightened child. It didn't roar because it was cruel. It roared because it was afraid. Afraid of being unworthy, afraid of being unseen, afraid of not being loved. And so it shouted hope in someone, anyone would hear it. So he sat with it. Not to fix it, but to be with it. And in that quiet companionship, something inside him relaxed. The tension in his chest loosened. The pressure to be perfect eased. And for the first time, he felt compassion not for others, but for himself. That night, he walked beneath the stars. The gravel crunched softly beneath his feet. The wind moved gently through the trees. He stopped by the pond and looked at his reflection. For once, he didn't flinch. He simply bowed to the face staring back at him and to everything it had carried. The fear, the doubt, the shame, all of it, all of him. No longer enemies. Just old companions finally seen. It was near the end of his stay when the teacher found him again, this time in the garden, kneeling in the soil. He was pulling weeds, his sleeves rolled back, hands streaked with dirt. Yet his posture was calm, no longer stiff with effort. He moved with presence, each tug of a root deliberate, unhurried. She stood beside him for a while before speaking. "You've changed," she said. He looked up, smiled slightly. "I haven't become enlightened, if that's what you mean." She shook her head. "I didn't say you changed your mind. I said you changed." He sat back on his heels. "I still hear the voice," he said. "The one that doubts, that criticizes. But now, I hear another one too." She waited. He touched his chest softly. "It says, 'I'm here, I see you. Even this is okay.'" The teacher nodded. That voice was always there. You just never knew how to listen for it. They sat together in the soft sunlight. "I used to think practice was about conquering the self," he said. "It's about meeting the self," she replied, "with clarity and with love." He looked out across the garden. The breeze moved through rows of vegetables. A bee buzzed nearby. Life was simple, full, enough. "Sometimes I still fall into the old stories," he admitted. I still think I need to be better, faster, stronger. You will, she said gently. That's the habit of the mind. But now you know how to return. To what she smiled, to the part of you that was never broken. He was quiet for a moment. Then he whispered, I never thought that part existed, and yet she said, rising to her feet. You're sitting in it now. He watched her walk away, her steps quiet, steady. Later that evening, he stood again before the meditation hall. He bowed not to the room, but to the path that had led him through fire and back to himself. The voice still whispered as he sat down, but he no longer feared it. He welcomed it, and in doing so, he learned the deepest truth of all. You don't have to silence the mind to find peace. You only have to stop abandoning yourself. Sometimes the hardest journey is the one inward, not across mountains or rivers, but through layers of doubt, shame, and fear, until we arrive finally at the quiet truth. We were never unworthy. We had simply forgotten how to sit with ourselves gently. And when we remember, something begins to soften. We no longer fight our minds. We no longer flee our feelings. We simply return again and again to presence. But life does not pause for our healing. Even in peace, the world keeps turning, and not everyone we meet will walk gently. In our next story, we return to the road, a merchant, a thief, and a lesson that arrives not in words, but in the space between fear and freedom. Let us walk that road now. The road wound through the hills like a ribbon dropped by a careless hand. Dust rose with each step, and the sun pressed low against the horizon, casting long shadows across the path. A merchant walked alone, his pack slung across one shoulder, his breath slow but steady. He had traveled this route many times, trading spices and cloth between villages. He knew the turns and bends, the streams and stones. He also knew the risks. The forests beyond the ridge were quiet by day, but not always by night. He adjusted the weight of his pack and continued on. The path narrowed as it reached a stretch of trees. The shadows thickened. The air grew cool. Birds fell silent. He felt it before he heard it, the sudden shift in stillness. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but watching. Then a rustle, a footstep, a voice. Leave the bag. The merchant stopped. A figure stepped from the trees. Young, lean eyes, sharp with fear, masked as anger. In his hand was a blade, not large, but real enough. His voice wavered as he repeated, "Leave it, now." The merchant looked at him. He didn't speak. The thief shifted uncomfortably. "Don't try anything, just give it to me." Still the merchant said nothing. He set the pack down slowly. Then gently he sat beside it on the ground. The thief blinked. "What are you doing?" The merchant looked up at him, calm. "You seem tired. Sit. Rest a moment." The thief frowned, eyes darting. "Are you trying to trick me?" "No," the merchant said simply. "You look hungry." He reached into the side of the pack and pulled out a small cloth bundle. From it, he unwrapped 2 rice balls and set them on a flat stone between them. "I was saving these for dinner, but you're welcome to one." The thief stared at the food, confused, suspicious, silent. After a long moment, he lowered the blade just slightly and sat though he kept his distance. He watched the merchant carefully. The merchant took a bite, chewed slowly. "My name is Kaito." The thief didn't respond. "You don't have to tell me yours," Kaito added. "I imagine the road hasn't been kind." The thief looked down. "No," he said finally. "It hasn't." They ate in silence. The sun continued to fall, the sky streaked with orange and gold. After finishing, the thief looked at the bag. "There's coin in there," a little Kaito replied. "Enough to return home." "Why didn't you run?" Kaito smiled. "Because you weren't going to hurt me." The thief bristled. "You don't know that." "No," Kaito said. "But I saw your hands shaking." A pause. "You were more afraid than I was," he added gently. The thief looked away. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was quieter. "I didn't want to do this. I just didn't know what else to do." Kaito nodded. "Sometimes we end up on roads we never meant to walk." He reached into the pack again, pulled out a folded cloth pouch and placed it between them. "There are 6 coins in there. Enough for food, maybe more if you're careful." The thief stared at the pouch. "I don't deserve that," he said. "Maybe not," Kaito replied. "But perhaps it's not about deserving." He stood, brushed dust from his robe, and hoisted the pack onto his shoulder, lighter now, but not just in weight. He turned to the thief. "Everyone steals when they're starving," he said. "The question is what you do once you've eaten." And then, without waiting for thanks or protest, he walked on his steps, slow, unhurried, like someone who had already arrived. The thief remained seated long after the merchant disappeared into the horizon. The cloth pouch lay untouched beside him, its quiet weight more unsettling than the blade in his own hand. He stared at it. Part of him still waited for the trick, for the merchant to return with others to demand something to punish him. But the road behind was silent. Only the trees moved, whispering secrets he couldn't quite hear. He picked up the pouch and opened it. 6 coins. Enough for food, for a place to sleep, maybe even for passage to a village where no one knew his name. His stomach turned, not from hunger this time, but something else. Guilt. Not the kind that shouts. The kind that arrives like a cold wind, quiet, creeping, undeniable. He hadn't always been like this. Once he had helped his mother carry water. Once he had chased fireflies with his brother and laughed so hard his ribs ached. But life had turned, as it often does, and he had followed the only paths he saw. He tied the pouch and stood. The sun had set fully now. The road glowed with the last embers of twilight. He walked slowly, not toward the forest where he had been sleeping, but back toward the main path, toward the direction the merchant had taken. He didn't know why. He didn't know what he would say, but something in him wanted to walk forward. Several days later, in a small village by the river, Kaito stood beneath a tree, laying out cloth for trade. He had sold most of his spices already. His journey was nearly done. As he packed the last of his goods, he felt a presence behind him. He turned. It was the thief. Cleaned calmer, uncertain, no blade in sight. They looked at each other for a long moment. The thief reached into his pocket and held out the cloth pouch. "I couldn't keep it," he said. Kaito shook his head gently. "It was a gift. I don't want your pity." "It wasn't pity," Kaito replied. "It was trust." The thief's hands trembled slightly. "Why would you trust me?" "Because someone once trusted me," Kaito said, "when I didn't deserve it." A long silence passed between them, thick but not heavy. Then the thief lowered his hand. "I want to work," he said. "I don't know what I'm good at, but I can learn." Kaito smiled. "Then stay. Help me finish this market. We'll find a place for you to begin." And so they did. Not as master and servant, not as debtor and benefactor. but as two people who had both at different times wandered far from themselves, and who now by simple grace had found the road back. Weeks passed. The thief, whose name was now spoken more often than remembered as thief, began to take shape again. Not just in the eyes of others, but in his own. He swept the floors of the shop. He learned to measure spices and fold cloth properly. He practiced speaking gently with customers, though the habit of sharpness took time to loosen its grip. Kaito never pushed him. He offered tasks, not tests, guidance, not commands. And in the stillness of that approach, something unexpected grew dignity. For the first time in a long time, the young man stood a little taller, not with pride, but with steadiness. The kind that comes from being trusted without condition. One evening, as they closed the shop together, the young man asked the question that had been growing quietly inside him. "Why didn't you hate me?" Kaito didn't answer right away. He lit the lanterns, checked the bolts on the crates, and swept the last dust from the doorway. Only then did he speak. "Because hate is easy," he said. "Understanding takes more work." The young man sat on the step watching the fireflies blink in the dusk. "I still don't understand myself," he admitted. Kaito sat beside him. "That's all right. Understanding doesn't always come before kindness." They watched the village settle into night. Children were being called inside. A woman hummed while folding laundry. Somewhere a flute played slow, steady, almost shy. "I used to think the world was against me," the young man said. "That everyone wanted something and that I had to take before someone else did." And now Kaito asked. He was quiet for a long time. "I think I was the one who disappeared. I stopped believing anyone would help, so I became what I thought I had to be." Kaito nodded. "We become hard to protect what's soft. But soft isn't weakness." "No," the young man said. "It's what I miss the most." That night as he lay on his mat under the same roof as the man he once tried to rob, he whispered something into the darkness. Not a prayer, not a vow, but a simple truth. "I want to stay soft." And somewhere deep within, something hardened began to melt. Kindness doesn't always come wrapped in softness. Sometimes it arrives in the middle of fear when one person chooses not to fight, but to listen. Not to judge, but to trust. And in that space, what seems impossible begins to shift. Not because force was used, but because presence was offered. The world does not change by grand gestures alone. Often it changes when one person chooses to see another clearly beneath the fear, beneath the mask, beneath the story. But what happens when we face ourselves and find nothing we want to see? When our greatest battle isn't with the world, but with our own past. In the next story, we meet a man haunted not by loss, but by guilt, who was not searching for peace. He doesn't believe he deserves it. And yet the path meets him anyway. Let us walk beside him now. He did not speak to anyone on the road. His clothes were simple but not worn. His face was calm but distant. His silence did not feel like peace. It felt like exile. Chosen, maintained, protected. The villagers called him the man from nowhere. He arrived quietly one day, took a room in the smallest house at the edge of town, and kept to himself. He worked with his hands, repairing roofs, hauling stones, fixing broken wheels, but never lingered. He never smiled. He never joined the festivals or sat at the tea stalls with the others. He did what needed doing, then disappeared into the hills. Some said he was a monk who had lost his way. Others said he was a soldier. Some said nothing at all, but all agreed on one thing. He carried a weight they could not see. One afternoon, a boy followed him, curious, barefoot, and too young to know what guilt looks like. The man walked up the path to the forest, his tools wrapped in cloth. The boy trailed behind, stepping quietly until the man finally turned. He didn't speak, just looked. The boy hesitated, then said, "Can I help?" The man stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. They spent the afternoon gathering stones from a collapsed footpath, stacking them into a new wall along the trail. The boy chatted freely about birds, his older sister, the festival next week, and a dog he hoped to find. The man said nothing, but when the boy tripped, the man caught his arm gently. When the boy tired, the man handed him water. When the boy's shirt tore on a branch, the man tied it back together with a strip from his own sleeve. At dusk, they sat beside the wall they'd built, and the boy leaned back on his elbows. "Why don't you talk much?" he asked. The man looked away. Not much to say. "You have a nice voice," the boy replied. "You should use it more." The man almost smiled. Almost. Then the boy added, "My papa says people who are quiet have loud hearts." The man stood, gathered his tools, began to walk. "Will you be here tomorrow?" the boy called after him. The man didn't answer, but the next day he returned, and the boy was waiting. Days turned into weeks. The boy kept coming, so did the man. They rebuilt more of the trail, cleared brush, patched the roof of an old hut once used by travelers. The boy talked as he worked stories of the village of dreams he'd had, of questions that rose like smoke in his mind. The man listened, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with silence, but always fully present. One morning, as they rested under a pine tree, the boy asked, "Were you a monk before?" The man's hands stilled. "Some people say you were," the boy added, "that you left a temple." The man didn't answer. The boy shrugged. "I think maybe you were. You move like one." The man looked at him. "What does that mean?" The boy grinned. "Like you're carrying something but not letting it crush you." The man looked away. They sat in silence for a while. Then quietly, he said, "I left because I made a mistake." The boy blinked. "Everyone makes mistakes, not like this." The boy frowned. "Did you hurt someone?" The man didn't speak. The boy didn't ask again. Later that afternoon, as they carried stones down the hill, the man paused and sat on a flat boulder. The boy sat beside him. "I was angry," the man said, not looking at him. "A long time ago, I let that anger guide me. I said something cruel to someone I loved. I thought I was right. I thought they needed to hear it." He paused. They left the next morning. I never saw them again. The boy was quiet now. I joined the temple to atone. I thought if I was silent enough, disciplined enough, empty enough, the past would disappear. "Did it?" the boy asked softly. "No," the man said. "I just stopped speaking to it." They sat there, side by side, shadows growing longer around them. Finally, the boy said, "Maybe you don't have to disappear to be sorry." The man looked at him. "Maybe building things is a way of saying something too," the boy added. The man didn't reply, but he stayed on that stone long after the boy had gone home. And for the first time in years, he let the memory come, not to punish himself, but to sit beside it. He saw the face he had once loved, heard the words he had shouted, felt the silence that followed. He didn't turn away. He didn't deny. He bowed his head, not in shame, but in recognition. This was also part of his life, and it deserved to be carried not as a chain, but as a stone, carefully placed in the wall he now helped to build. Summer softened into early autumn. The trees began to glow with firelight, amber, ochre, crimson, and the wind carried the first chill of the changing season. The man and the boy continued to meet, though their projects became fewer. Much of the path had been restored, the forest cleared, the broken things tended. But still they met. One morning, the boy arrived with a bundle wrapped in cloth, awkward, clumsy, but carried with pride. Inside was a rice ball, a boiled egg, and a few slices of pickled radish. "My mother helped," he said shyly. The man bowed his head. "Thank you." They sat on the edge of the trail, legs dangling over the hillside, looking down at the rooftops of the village far below. "Do you ever think about going back?" the boy asked. The man didn't answer right away. "To the person you lost," the boy added, "to say something." The man looked out over the valley. "I don't know where they went." The boy considered this. "Then maybe they'll come here." The man almost laughed, not because it was likely, but because of how simply the boy said it, like the world could still work that way. "Would you want to see them again?" the boy asked. The man nodded slowly. "Yes, but not to fix anything. Just to say, I see now." He placed the cloth from the meal carefully beside him. "I used to think regret was proof of my guilt, that if I let go of it, I'd forget what I'd done. And now," the man looked down at his hands, "now I think regret is a doorway. It hurts, but only because something inside wants to heal." The boy didn't fully understand, but he listened like he always did. That afternoon, as they parted ways near the foot of the hill, the boy turned and said, "You know the village doesn't call you the man from nowhere anymore." The man raised an eyebrow. "No, they call you the builder." The man paused. Something caught in his throat. Not sorrow this time, not guilt, something else. He gave a small nod. The boy grinned and ran ahead. The man stood still, the sun warm on his back, and for the first time in many years, he looked not behind him, but forward. The past had not vanished. It never would. But it had softened, and he no longer had to disappear to live alongside it. He would continue to build, not because it erased what was broken, but because it honored what remained. Some wounds do not close with time. They mend through presence, through returning, through rebuilding not what was lost, but what is still possible. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means remembering without turning away. It means saying, "Yes, this happened and still I will live." Guilt can harden the heart, but when held gently, it becomes a doorway to compassion, to responsibility, to quiet redemption. Our next story begins at a temple, but it is not a story of monks. It is a story of sweeping floors, of one man's refusal to let go of anger, and of what happens when that anger meets something it cannot shake. Let us step through that gate now. The temple sat high in the hills, surrounded by pine trees that whispered with every breeze. It was not grand. Its wood was faded, its roof slightly uneven, but it was clean, quiet, steady, and it was home to a monk whose task was simple: sweep the grounds. Each morning before sunrise, he would take up the broom and begin. He swept the stone path from the gate to the inner hall. He swept the courtyard. He swept the wooden steps and the spaces between the garden stones. He moved like the wind, soft, thorough, constant. He had done this for years. Some visitors thought it beneath him. He should be teaching, they'd whisper. He's wasted on chores. He says nothing, offers no guidance, but others noticed something different. When he swept, the leaves seemed to fall more slowly. The wind seemed to pause. Time moved differently around him. One morning, a visitor arrived. A man with hard eyes and a tighter jaw. He had traveled far, searching not for peace, but for proof. He had read many books, debated many teachings, sat through long ceremonies. None had changed him. None had quieted the fire inside. He came to the temple, hoping for something real, something he could test. When he arrived, the monk was already sweeping. "Are you the teacher here?" the man asked. The monk bowed slightly but said nothing. The man frowned. "I came for insight." "Are you not going to offer any?" The monk continued sweeping. The man stepped closer. "Is this some kind of lesson?" Still no reply. Annoyed, the man sat on the temple steps, arms crossed. He watched the monk work. Every stroke of the broom was the same, deliberate, even without rush. There was no drama in it, no display, just motion, just care. After some time, the man couldn't help himself. "How can this possibly matter?" he demanded. "You sweep, the wind blows. You clean and dust returns. It's useless." The monk paused, looking up at him. Then he offered the broom. The man stared at it. "What you want me to sweep now?" The monk said nothing. After a long moment, the man stood, took the broom, and began to sweep. At first, he did it harshly, quick, forceful strokes as if trying to prove something. The bristles scattered leaves but stirred more dust than they settled. His breath quickened, his grip tightened. The monk watched calmly. Finally, the man threw the broom down. "This is absurd!" he shouted. "What does this have to do with anything?" With awakening, with truth, the monk bent down, picked up the broom, and resumed sweeping, same rhythm, same care. Then in a voice soft but steady, he spoke. "When your mind is a storm, no truth can land. When your hands are angry, no tool works properly. When your heart demands answers, it cannot hear silence." The man froze. The monk looked up. "Sweep or don't, but know that how you do it is the lesson." Then he turned and continued the path behind him, growing clear with each stroke. The man didn't leave that day. Something about the monk's words, few as they were, stuck to him like ash from a dying fire. He sat on the temple steps, long after the monk disappeared into the garden, staring at the clean path now glinting faintly in the morning light. No truth can land. No tool works properly. No silence can be heard. He had come expecting something sharp and profound, some riddle to unlock, some concept to grasp. But all he had been offered was a broom. And yet, something in him now stirred. The next morning before dawn, he returned. The monk was already at the gate, broom in hand. This time the man didn't speak. He simply bowed. The monk handed him a second broom. They swept side by side. The rhythm was different now. At first, the man's movements were still stiff, but he followed the monk's lead. Less force, more care. He noticed the sound of bristles on stone, the way leaves clung stubbornly to corners, the curve of the path beneath, layers of dust. He had never looked so closely. He had never moved so slowly. Each morning he returned. No words, no lessons, only sweeping. But something began to happen. Not suddenly, not dramatically. His thoughts, once loud and fast, began to space themselves out. His body, once tense and upright, began to loosen. He noticed things he'd never seen before, the way the dew gathered on moss, the tremble of pine needles in the early light, the faint scent of sandalwood drifting from the altar hall, and the monk still silent, still sweeping, never told him what he was doing right. He simply allowed him to keep doing it. Until one morning, as the man gathered a final pile of leaves, he paused and spoke quietly. "All this time I've tried to find peace by thinking harder." He looked at the monk. "But maybe peace isn't something to find. Maybe it's what's left when I stop trying." The monk placed his broom against the wall. For the first time he bowed, not just as greeting, but in respect. Then he said, "The dust returns, but now you know how to meet it." And for the first time in many years, the man smiled, not because he had found the answer, but because he had learned how to stop needing one. He stayed at the temple for 3 more days, not to seek new lessons, not to ask new questions, but simply to be. He swept each morning, sat quietly by the koi pond in the afternoon, helped gather fallen branches after wind passed through the hills. His movement slowed, his need to prove himself faded. There was nothing to gain now, only something to return to. On the final evening, he stood by the gate with his pack slung over one shoulder. The sky was violet and pine shadows stretched long across the courtyard. The monk approached, holding something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to the man. It was the broom, the same one they had shared. The man looked down at it. Worn bristles, a smooth wooden handle shaped by time and touch. "I'm not staying," he said. The monk nodded. "I'm not a monk." Another nod. "I still get angry." The monk smiled. "Then sweep when you're angry." The man looked at the broom again. He realized it wasn't a symbol. It wasn't a metaphor. It was exactly what it was: a simple tool, a task, a path. He bowed deeply. "Thank you," he said. The monk didn't respond. He just turned, picked up another broom, and began sweeping the courtyard, dust rising, settling, rising again. The man walked down the path through the trees, the broom tied to his pack. He would return to his old life, to the noise, the challenge, the imperfection. But he carried something new now, not answers, not doctrines, but rhythm. And when the mind grew loud and the heart became restless, he knew what to do. He would clear a small space, he would pick up the broom, and he would begin again, stroke by stroke, breath by breath, leaf by leaf. Not all storms require shelter. Some ask us to pick up a broom, because peace is not always found in retreat. Sometimes it is built in the middle of the dust, in the quiet return to simple things, in the act of caring for the world even when it does not stay clean. The mind will wander, the leaves will fall again, but now we know we can meet them both with steady hands and a quiet heart. And yet not all struggles live on the surface. Some hide deeper beneath politeness, beneath success, beneath the quiet masks we wear to protect ourselves from being seen. In our next story, we meet a man praised by all, yet tormented by one question. He cannot escape. Who am I when no one is watching? Let us walk with him now as he begins to peel back the layers, not to abandon himself, but to finally meet what's underneath. He was respected. In every village he passed through, people bowed. They called him wise, generous, measured. His robes were always clean, his words carefully chosen, his presence like cool shade on a summer day. He was a teacher, yes, but more than that. He was a symbol, a model of what others believed a good man should be. And he believed it too. At least most days. He had spent years building this image. Years perfecting the right tone, the right posture, the gentle nods and silent pauses that made others feel seen even when he no longer felt much of anything himself. But when the ceremonies ended, when the crowds dispersed, when he returned to the empty temple and lit the final candle for the night, there was a silence he could not fill, a restlessness beneath his skin, a voice quiet but persistent asking, "What remains?" When no one is looking, he tried to meditate through it. He recited ancient verses, he wrote thoughtful letters. He gave more and more of himself in public, hoping that the praise would outweigh the question. But it never did. One evening after a gathering where he had spoken about compassion and non-attachment, he found himself staring into a bowl of cold tea, unmoving. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, from fatigue. He no longer knew what was real. The mask fit too well. He left the next morning with no announcement, no explanation. He packed a small bag, left a note for his students, and walked west toward the mountain paths where no one knew his name. For 3 days he walked in silence. He ate little, slept beneath trees, watched the moon rise, not as a symbol but as itself, cold, distant, unchanging. On the 4th day, he reached a stone hut tucked into a cliffside. He had heard of it once years ago, a place where an old hermit lived, accepting no students, giving no sermons. He approached the door, knocked once, no answer, knocked again. Still nothing, so he sat. He waited the entire day. Only at dusk did the door open. A woman stood there, her hair gray tied back with twine, her robe plain frayed at the edges. She looked at him not with curiosity, but with complete, effortless seeing. "You wore your mask for too long," she said. He bowed his head, and for the first time in decades, he had no idea what to say. She said nothing more that night, simply turned, stepped aside, and let him in. The hut was small. 1 room, a hearth, a cot, a teapot, blackened with age, a pile of firewood. Nothing unnecessary, everything used. She gestured to the floor. He sat, she brewed tea. Still no questions, still no welcome, just steam rising into silence. He watched her move without ceremony, without haste, as if everything she did had been done 1,000 times before, and would be done 1,000 times again. When the tea was ready, she handed him a cup. He bowed. They drank in silence. The wind moved outside. A shutter creaked. Somewhere far below, an owl called into the dusk. After some time, he whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." She looked at him. "You never did," she said. He looked down ashamed. "I've built everything on an image," he confessed. "Every word, every act. But lately, I can't tell whether I'm the teacher or the performance." She stirred the fire. "That's because the teacher was never a role," she said. "It was simply your attention." He frowned. "Then why do I feel hollow? Because your attention left," she said, "and your performance kept walking." He closed his eyes. Tears came. Not loud, not violent, just quiet. Honest salt on his cheeks. "I'm tired," he said. "I know. I don't want to be special anymore." "You never were," she said gently. "You were simply useful." And then admired. He let out a small breath, half laughter, half relief. Then what now? She placed another log on the fire. Now she said, "You stop trying to be anything." He stared into the flames. "I don't know how." She looked at him not with pity but with stillness. "Then stay," she said. "Sit, work, sleep. Let the mask fall slowly. When you are no longer holding anything up, you'll begin to feel what was underneath it all along." He looked at her unsure. She stood and walked toward the door. "You're not broken," she said. "Just exhausted from pretending not to be human." And with that, she left him to the fire. He sat there long into the night, not as a teacher, not as a symbol, but as a man with nothing left to prove. The days that followed were slow. He swept the floor, chopped wood, carried water from the stream that wound along the cliff's edge. The woman gave him no lessons, no schedule, no rituals, only space, only tasks. At first, his instincts fought it. Each silence begged to be filled with wisdom. Each simple act felt incomplete without meaning. He kept reaching for something to perform, some gesture to justify his presence, but nothing was asked of him. And gradually the reaching stopped. He woke with the sun, ate what was given, moved with the day. He began to feel things he hadn't allowed in years, the cold sting of water on his hands, the ache in his legs after walking the hills, the tight knot of grief that sometimes appeared for no clear reason and then dissolved again like mist. One morning while mending a cracked bucket, he paused. He looked at his hands. They were rough, shaking slightly but steady. He was not thinking, not striving, not speaking to any crowd real or imagined. He was just here. For the first time in a long while, he felt real. That evening by the fire, the woman asked, "Do you still miss the man everyone praised?" He thought for a moment. "I miss the certainty," he said. "The feeling that I mattered." She nodded. "And now," he stirred the coals. "Now I feel smaller." She looked at him. "Is that bad?" He smiled. "No. It's like standing under a wide sky, humbling but free." She didn't speak again that night. The next morning he gathered his things. She met him at the door. "You found what you needed?" she asked. He bowed. "Not what I expected, but yes." She nodded. One stepped aside and let him pass. As he descended the narrow path back toward the valley, he carried no titles, no robes of status, no need to be seen. Just a man walking, and for the first time being himself was enough. We spend so much of life trying to become someone wise, someone good, someone worthy of love. But there comes a moment, quiet, unexpected, when all the becoming fades and we are simply here. Not impressive, not certain, but true. And in that truth we find rest. Because it was never about being perfect. It was about being present, about removing the mask and discovering we are still whole beneath it. But not every journey happens in stillness. Some begin with noise, a harsh word, an unfair judgment, a spark of anger that threatens to burn more than we realize. In the next story, a young monk faces that fire, not in the world but in himself. And in that heat, he must choose react or reflect. Let us follow him now. The young monk was sweeping the temple steps when it happened. A visitor, tall and proud, dressed in fine robes, strode across the courtyard without removing his sandals. Dust and footprints marked the polished floor the monk had just cleaned. The young monk paused, holding his broom midair. He took a breath, then another. But something in him flared. The visitor glanced at him with indifference, as if the monk were no more than a shadow in his path. The monk bowed politely. "Sir, we ask that guests remove their sandals before entering the main hall." The visitor stopped, turned. "And who are you to ask?" he said, his voice laced with amusement. "A servant, a janitor. I've come to speak with the master." The monk's jaw tightened. "I'm a student here, and these are the rules."
was. The visitor laughed softly. I've met many monks. Most of them understood humility. Perhaps you still have much to learn. Then he turned and walked toward the main hall, sandals tapping loudly against the wood. The young monk stood frozen. The broom in his hands suddenly felt heavy like a weapon. Anger surged through his chest, hot, fast, sharp. How dare he? Did he think robes made him superior? That years of sweeping floors made the monk less than him? His hands clenched the broom tighter. That night, the monk could not sleep. He replayed the moment again and again, what he should have said, what he could have done. 100 imaginary conversations played out in his mind, none of them ending in peace. By morning, he was exhausted. He found the master in the garden pruning a tree. The young monk bowed low. "Master," he said, "yesterday I was insulted. A visitor mocked me, disrespected the temple. I feel ashamed for not responding." The master clipped a branch. "And what would you have said? I wanted to defend myself," the monk admitted, "to make him see he was wrong." The master looked at the branch in his hand. "And did he?" The monk hesitated. "No." "Then your silence was not weakness," the master said. "It was space." The monk frowned. "But inside me, I was shouting." The master smiled. "Then your real work is not with him." He handed the branch to the monk. "Cut away what is dead," he said, "but do it with care. Even anger has roots. You must understand it before you prune it." And with that, he returned to the tree, snipping gently, letting the silence do what words could not. The young monk carried the branch to the compost pile, but his mind was still tangled in heat. He had been taught patience. He had studied silence. But this was different. This was insult. And something inside him still wanted justice, still longed to be seen as worthy. Later that afternoon, he sat in the shade of the bell tower, turning the master's words over in his mind. Even anger has roots. You must understand it before you prune it. He closed his eyes. He followed the feeling inward. Where had the anger come from? Not just from the visitor's words. It went deeper. He remembered being a child trying to help in the fields, only to be pushed aside. "You're too small," they said. "Let the older ones work." He remembered speaking in class, only to be laughed at for getting it wrong. He remembered the first time he entered the temple, afraid that he didn't belong. Each memory added another layer to the root. And at the center of it all was a question he had never dared ask aloud. Am I enough? That was the source. Not the visitor, not the insult, but the doubt that had lived quietly inside him for years. When he opened his eyes, the bell had begun to ring. The sound moved through the air like water, clear, slow, washing everything it touched. He didn't feel peaceful, but he felt honest. That evening after the meal, the master invited him to walk in the garden. They moved in silence for a while, listening to the gravel shift beneath their feet. The monk finally spoke. "Master, I think I was angry because I believed him." The master stopped walking. "Believed what? That I'm nothing, that I have no worth." The master looked at him gently. "You've mistaken his ignorance for a mirror. That's easy to do." The monk's eyes lowered. "I want to not care. I want to be beyond it. But I'm not." The master smiled. "Then start there. Not with who you wish to be, but with where you truly are." They stood together beneath a tree. The master plucked a leaf and held it out. "This leaf is no less part of the tree because it trembles in the wind," He let it go, and they both watched it fall, spinning, soft, still complete. The next morning, the young monk returned to the steps with his broom. Same path, same stones, same wind. But something in him had changed. He no longer swept to be seen. He no longer moved with the weight of unspoken shame. He simply swept. Later that week, the visitor returned. Again, he strode across the courtyard, sandals on chin lifted. But this time the monk did not stop him. He bowed, gently, quietly. The visitor paused, perhaps expecting confrontation, but none came. Instead, the monk returned to sweeping, unbothered, present. The visitor looked confused, then slightly uncomfortable. His voice was softer now. "Is the master here?" "Yes," the monk said simply. "He is." He gestured toward the hall. The visitor bowed stiffly and walked inside. And that was all. No drama, no retaliation. Just space. Later, the master approached the young monk as he folded linens beside the well. "You didn't correct him this time." "No," the monk said. "I realized. His dust is not mine to clean." The master smiled. "And your anger," the monk paused. "Still there sometimes. But I'm learning to see it before it speaks for me." He held up a folded robe. "And like this," he said, smoothing the fabric, "I can choose how to hold it." That evening, he walked the temple grounds at dusk. Fireflies danced near the lanterns. Somewhere a flute played from the far end of the hill. He no longer needed to be above anger. He only needed to meet it softly, clearly, before it hardened. And in doing so, he found something better than pride. He found peace with himself.
Anger often enters with a sharp tongue, but it stays because of a quiet wound. We think we must conquer it, silence it, suppress it, outgrow it. But often what anger needs most is to be heard without being obeyed. When we see it clearly, we see ourselves more clearly. Not as failures, not as saints, but as humans learning to hold fire without being burned. And just as anger can blind us, so can desire, not for power, not for wealth, but for answers. In our next story, a seeker goes deep into the mountains, desperate to find truth. But the teacher he meets offers no lecture, no scripture, no wisdom he can grasp. Only 3 words repeated again and again until something far deeper is revealed. Let us walk with him now into the silence of where truth cannot be forced, only received. He had searched everywhere, through temples and scrolls, through sermons and retreats. He had studied under famous teachers, memorized verses, practiced postures until his knees ached and his breath no longer felt like his own. Still, he did not find it. Truth, not a version of it, not someone else's description. He wanted to touch it, to taste it, to know. And so someone told him, "Go to the mountain. There's a teacher there. She lives in silence, speaks to no one, but if she speaks to you at all, listen." So he went. It took him 3 days to climb the trail. The air grew thinner, the path narrower. He slept beneath pine trees and dreamed of riddles he could solve, of questions he could answer. When he reached the peak, he found a stone hut with a garden of herbs and a wooden gate tied with string. He bowed at the threshold and waited. Hours passed. At dusk, the door opened. A woman appeared older than he expected, wrapped in faded robes, hair silver and wild. She looked at him, said nothing. He bowed again. "I've come seeking truth." She studied him, then gestured toward a wooden bench beside the garden. He followed. She sat. He sat beside her. Silence. The wind moved. A sparrow called. He opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, she raised one finger. Then softly, she spoke. Not that. He blinked. I what? She looked at him calmly. Not that. He frowned. Not what? She smiled slightly. Not that. He waited, confused, frustrated. Master, he said, I came a long way. I've studied for years. I'm ready to receive whatever insight you. She raised a hand. Not that. He fell silent. They sat until night. She rose, bowed slightly, and disappeared into the hut. The next morning he returned, and again she said only, not that, and again the next day, and again. Each time he brought her a new idea, a new insight, a new phrase he'd cherished. She would look at him gently and say, not that. Until one day he brought nothing. He sat beside her. No words, no seeking, only breath, only wind, and she said nothing at all. He did not know when the shift began. There was no grand realization, no sudden opening of the sky, just space. At first it was uncomfortable. He fidgeted, counted breaths, waited for her to speak again, waited for something, but she said nothing, and slowly the waiting faded. He began to notice the rhythm of her movements, the way she poured water, tended the herbs, swept the steps with no rush at all. He began to rise with the sun like she did, to walk slowly like she did, to sit without reason like she did. His questions grew quiet, not because they were answered, but because he no longer needed them to be. One morning, as they sat by the garden, he turned to her. There was no urgency in his voice, no pleading. Why did you say, not that? She looked at him, eyes soft. Because each time you spoke, she said you offered me an idea, a conclusion, something you were clinging to. He nodded slowly. And truth? He asked. She picked up a stone from the path, held it in her hand. Truth is not what you carry, she said. It's what remains when you put everything down. He looked at her. You mean, it's nothing, she smiled. No, it's not that. He laughed quietly at first, then with warmth he hadn't felt in years. He understood now, not intellectually, not as a concept, but as stillness. Truth was not a sentence, not a destination. It was the space between all the grasping. That evening they drank tea together. No talk of insight, no talk of attainment. Just 2 cups, 2 hands, 1 moment, and nothing to chase. The next day he rose before dawn. The sky was still deep blue, and the stars had not yet vanished. He stood at the edge of the cliff, where the mountain met the clouds, and he breathed. Not to calm himself, not to practice, just to breathe. He didn't feel enlightened, he didn't feel finished, but he no longer felt lost. Later that morning, he found the teacher tending to a patch of soil near the hut. She looked up, sensing him before he spoke. I'll be leaving today, he said softly. She gave a single nod as if she had known already. He stepped closer. I have no words of thanks that feel big enough. She placed her trowel down gently. No need, she said. He bowed deeply, this time not in reverence, but in recognition of her, of the silence, of the truth that had no name. As he turned to leave, she spoke one last time. When the mind says, this is it, she said, look again. He smiled and replied, not that. She laughed, and he walked down the path not as a seeker chasing answers, but as someone who finally knew how to let them come and go. With each step, he felt lighter, not because he had found what he was looking for, but because he had stopped searching with his hands.
Now he listened with his life. Sometimes the greatest wisdom is not spoken, but felt in the quiet after the question fades. We spend so much of our lives building ladders to reach something higher. But truth often waits in the space beneath our striving. It asks nothing from us, only that we stop gripping what we think it must be. And once we stop grasping, we begin to see the cup doesn't need to be filled with meaning, only emptied of illusion. But what happens when the lesson doesn't come in silence, when it arrives instead through pain, through loss, through the hard choice to let go of someone we love? In our next story, a teacher faces a farewell, not out of failure, but as an offering. Because love too has its own silence, and sometimes the kindest act is to step aside. Let us sit beside her now as she prepares to say goodbye. She had watched him grow from the day he arrived, nervous, eager, carrying more questions than breath, to now steady, focused, kind. He had been her student for nearly 7 years. 7 seasons of learning and forgetting, of failing and returning, of sitting side by side in silence until silence no longer felt empty. She had taught him to walk slowly, to listen fully, to bow, not just in form but in heart. And now he was ready. But she was not. She stood in the garden that morning, pruning herbs. The scissors clicked softly, but her mind was elsewhere. He would be leaving soon, called to another temple where he would guide others as she had guided him. It was what she had trained him for, what she had promised, and yet the ache in her chest was undeniable. When he entered the garden, she didn't turn. She knew his footsteps too well. "I'll go tomorrow," he said. She nodded, still pruning. "I've packed only what I need." Another nod. "I'm nervous." She smiled faintly, still not facing him. "That's good," she said. "It means you're not carrying certainty." He stepped closer. "Are you disappointed?" She stopped then, turned. Her eyes met his clear, soft, holding something that words could not carry. "No," she said. "I'm proud." A pause, and a little sad. He looked down. "Me too." They stood together in the sunlight, the scent of basil and pine drifting between them. Finally, he asked, "Will you be all right?" She placed the scissors on the stone wall. "Of course," she said, "because nothing is leaving." He frowned gently. "But I am." She shook her head. "You are simply continuing. The part of you that learned here will always be here." He was silent. Then he bowed low, full not as student to teacher, but as one whole heart to another. And for a moment, neither moved. Because sometimes love doesn't hold on. It lets go with grace. That evening, they shared one final meal. No ceremony, no farewell speech, just rice miso and wild greens from the garden, prepared the way they always had, eaten in silence as the sky dimmed into indigo. After the dishes were cleaned, they walked the grounds together. They moved slowly, not out of hesitation but respect. Each step a memory. Each pause a quiet thank you to the stones, the wind, the trees that had held so many lessons between them. They stopped by the old bench beneath the maple tree. It was where he had once wept after his first winter retreat, where he had asked if failure meant he wasn't meant for the path, where she had told him failure is not falling behind. It's refusing to return. He sat, she joined him. The wind tugged at the leaves, some already turning red. "I thought leaving would feel like success," he said. "But it feels like loss." She looked at him. "It is both." He nodded slowly. "I want to honor what you gave me." She smiled.
Then don't imitate it. Live it. He was quiet a long while, then asked, "How did you know it was time to let me go?" She closed her eyes for a moment. "When your questions became quieter than your listening," she said. "When I stopped seeing you reach and started seeing you return." He breathed in deeply. He understood. The next morning, just after sunrise, he bowed to her one last time at the gate. She didn't speak. She only bowed in return. And then with slow and steady steps, he walked down the path, not as her student, but as someone ready to teach through the way he lived. She stood at the gate for a long time after he disappeared from view. There were tears, but there was no clinging, because when we love well, we do not hold back what is ready to go. We release it fully, freely, knowing that letting go is also a form of continuation. The days after his departure were quiet. She returned to her routines, sweeping the garden paths, boiling tea in the mornings, trimming the bonsai in the west corridor. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She would catch herself setting 2 cups instead of 1, turning toward the sound of footsteps that weren't there, pausing before speaking aloud only to remember she was alone. There was no sadness in it, only tenderness, like a room still holding the warmth of someone who had just left. One afternoon, while hanging herbs to dry, she found a folded piece of paper tucked near the teapot, his handwriting careful, small, shaped by years of practice. She read, "Master, I know now that you were never trying to shape me into anything. You were simply making space for who I already was. And in that space I began to see myself clearly, not as perfect, not as finished, but as enough. I will teach others not through answers, but through listening as you did for me. With love, your student, always." She held the note to her chest and closed her eyes. There was no need to reply. He had heard her even in the silences. That night she lit a single candle in the hall. Not as a prayer, not as a ritual, but as a way of saying, "Go well, I am still here." And she was, steady, rooted, not because she had let go of him, but because she had never needed to hold him in the first place. To love without clinging, that is the quiet strength few ever see. It does not chase, it does not demand, it simply holds space, and when the time comes, lets go with grace. Because true teaching is not control, it is trust, and true love does not bind. It blesses the path ahead, even when it leads away. But not all departures are graceful. Sometimes the letting go comes with struggle, with resistance, with fear, with hands that don't yet know how to open. In our next story, a man faces a different kind of farewell. Not of a student, not of a teacher, but of the self he thought he needed to be. And what he discovers is that release is not a single act, but a practice. Let us walk beside him now as he learns how to loosen the grip, one thread at a time. He was the kind of man others admired from a distance. Quiet, composed, reliable. When things broke, he fixed them. When people cried, he listened. When pressure rose, he stayed calm. He was, as many said, a strong one, the kind of person who didn't need help, didn't ask for comfort, didn't falter, at least not where anyone could see. But strength worn too tightly becomes a kind of armor, and armor over time becomes a prison. He never allowed himself to grieve, not when his father died, not when the friend he loved most moved away, not when his heart cracked quietly during a winter no one noticed. He told himself, "This is life, this is normal, this is what being strong means." He built routines, kept busy, helped others. But inside, he was slowly disappearing. It wasn't that he felt numb. He felt too much, but he had learned long ago that showing pain meant weakness. And so he smiled politely. He said, "I'm fine." He carried everything alone. One day, he was asked to assist with rebuilding a community hall that had been damaged by windstorms. He accepted, without hesitation, as he always did. When he arrived, the others were already there, stacking planks, mixing mortar, laughing as they worked. Among them was a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, thin, clumsy, talkative. He tried to carry a wooden beam far too large for him. It slipped, crashed loudly, and startled a few nearby birds from the trees. Everyone laughed, even the boy, but the man didn't. He felt something tighten inside him, a deep, familiar urge to fix, to correct, to hold it all together. The boy ran up to him. "Can I help you carry those?" The man hesitated. "They're heavy." I know the boy grinned, but maybe they'll feel lighter with two. The man looked down. Something in the boy's voice, so free, so unconcerned with appearing capable, stirred something he hadn't felt in years. He handed the boy one end of the beam. Together, they lifted. It wobbled. They nearly dropped it. The boy laughed again. "We're a mess." And for the first time in what felt like forever, the man smiled. A real smile. One that cracked through the shell he had worn like a second skin. Because in that moment he realized, this child was not weak. He was free. That night he lay awake in his small room, staring at the ceiling beams above. The laughter of the boy echoed faintly in his chest. Not mockery, not noise, just lightness. He had forgotten what it felt like, to drop something and not apologize, to fail and not flinch, to be clumsy without shame. For so long he had held himself tightly, like a glass that must not tip. He had confused being steady with being silent. He had mistaken the absence of breakdowns for the presence of peace. But now he wondered, what had all that strength cost him? The next morning, the boy found him again. "Want help today?" He nodded. They worked side by side for hours. The boy talked endlessly about frogs he saw last week, about the best kind of bread, about how wind sounded different depending on your mood. None of it was important. All of it mattered. At one point, the man lifted a stack of tiles onto his shoulder. The boy frowned and said, "You don't always have to carry the biggest load, you know." The man chuckled. "Someone has to." The boy looked at him. "Or maybe we just think that because we don't want to be seen needing help." The words hit harder than the weight. He paused mid-step. The boy, unaware, kept walking. That evening, the man sat on the steps of the hall and stared out over the hills. The sun was setting slowly, throwing gold across the trees. An old memory came to him, his father sitting in the same posture, arms crossed, saying, "Never show weakness. The world will use it." He had believed it. He had lived it. But now, watching the boy throw stones into the river, missing more often than he hit, and laughing anyway, he began to wonder. Maybe strength wasn't the absence of softness. Maybe it was the courage to be seen. He placed his hands on his lap, unclenched for the first time in days. And he whispered, barely audible, even to himself, "I don't want to carry it all anymore." The next day, the boy didn't show up. The man waited longer than he meant to, pretending he was just getting an early start, pretending the silence didn't feel louder without the boy's chatter. By midday, he found out the boy had fallen sick of fever.
Nothing serious, but enough to keep him home. Still, the absence lingered. It wasn't just the help he missed. It was the mirror, the way the boy's freedom had reflected his own constraint. That evening, the man stood at the edge of the river. He carried no tools, no burdens, just a small stone in his hand. He turned it slowly, then threw it into the water. It landed with a soft plunk, sending ripples outward. And without meaning to, without planning it, he began to speak aloud. Not to anyone, just to the air, to the trees, to the silence. "I'm tired," he said. "I've been holding everything for so long, and I don't even know who asked me to." The words came slowly, but they came. I thought strength meant not crying, not needing, not breaking. But maybe real strength is staying when those things happen anyway. He exhaled. It wasn't a grand release. It was gentle, honest. The next morning, he visited the boy's house, brought a small jar of honey and rice cakes wrapped in cloth. The boy's mother answered the door and smiled in surprise. "He'll be happy to see you." The man stepped into the small room. The boy was sitting up, pale but grinning. "I thought you'd be halfway done without me." The man chuckled. Didn't feel like finishing alone. The boy looked at him for a moment, longer than usual. "Hey," the boy said, "you seem different." The man tilted his head. "How so? I don't know. Just softer." The man laughed, but this time there was no deflection. He sat beside the boy and said, "Turns out I don't need to be made of stone to be strong." The boy nodded. I already knew that. They sat there quiet and content, and in the stillness the man felt it clearly. He hadn't lost anything by letting go. He had gained something much greater. Not admiration, not control, but room finally for someone to walk beside him.
Strength does not always look like stillness. Sometimes it looks like softness, like saying, "I can't do this alone," like opening your hands after years of holding everything too tightly. We are taught to carry, to endure, to remain composed. But life is not a burden to survive. It is a path to be shared, stumbled through, wept through, laughed through, together. And when we stop performing, when we stop protecting ourselves from being seen, we discover something gentler. Beneath the armor, we were never meant to be perfect, only present. In our final story, we meet a traveler who has spent his life searching for wisdom, for teachers, for meaning. But what he finds is not something to grasp, but something to finally let rest. Let us join him now as he reaches the end of the road and discovers there is nothing left to seek. He had walked for years, through valleys and temples, over deserts and oceans. He had met sages, sat in silence, fasted beneath trees, studied sacred texts until the ink blurred behind his tired eyes. He had asked every question he could form. What is truth? What is the self? How does one awaken? And each answer he received only birthed more questions. He filled journals, he collected stories, he carried them like coins, each one valuable, but growing heavier with time. Now his beard had grayed, his pace had slowed, but the search still burned. One morning he reached a quiet village at the foot of a wooded hill. His sandals worn thin, his pack nearly empty. He intended to stay only a night. But as he sat on a bench near the village well, sipping water and watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky, he noticed a man nearby, sweeping. He was older, stooped, humming gently, moving slowly. Nothing remarkable about him. No robe, no shrine, no disciples. And yet, something about him felt whole.
The traveler watched as a child ran by and bumped into the man's broom. The man simply smiled and stepped aside. A dog barked, startling a basket of chickens. The man laughed softly and kept sweeping. Later, a woman spilled a basket of beans. The man bent without a word and helped gather them. Not once did he teach, not once did he instruct, but everything he did felt complete, unforced, true. The traveler approached. "Excuse me," he said. "I've visited dozens of teachers. May I ask what path you follow?" The man looked up, blinking as if surprised anyone had noticed him. "I follow the path beneath my feet," he said. The traveler paused. "And where does it lead?" The man smiled. "Here." Then he returned to sweeping. The traveler stayed. Just for a day, he told himself. Then another, and another. He watched the old man work mended fences, tending vegetables, chatting with children, humming to bees as he gardened. There were no deep teachings, no impressive rituals, just a steady, quiet presence. One afternoon, the traveler helped carry buckets from the well. "I've sought the truth for most of my life," he said. "Studied under great teachers, heard 1,000 answers." The old man nodded. "And have they helped?" The traveler hesitated. "Some, for a while. But eventually they all became more thoughts." The old man smiled. "That's what thoughts do." They walked in silence for a few steps. "I don't know what I'm still searching for," the traveler admitted. The old man stopped beside a fig tree, its leaves trembling in the wind. "Maybe you're not searching anymore," he said. "Maybe you're just not ready to stop." The traveler frowned. "How do I know when to stop?" The old man reached out, plucked a ripe fig and handed it to him. "You stop," he said, "when you realize you were never walking toward something." He gestured to the fig. "You were already there." The traveler bit into the fruit. It was soft, warm from the sun, impossibly sweet. For a moment, he closed his eyes. And in that moment, there was no more seeking, only presence, only taste, sunlight, breath, here. The next morning, the traveler rose before dawn. The village was still. Mist curled around the roofs like quiet breath. He sat on the same bench by the well, the same place where he had first seen the old man sweeping. But this time he didn't wait for answers. He simply watched the sky turn from gray to pale gold. The old man appeared shortly after carrying a basket of seed. He nodded to the traveler. "You're still here." The traveler smiled. "I don't think I'm going anywhere." They walked together through the garden, sowing gently. After a while, the traveler said, "I used to think wisdom was something I had to catch, like a bird." The old man chuckled. "And now I think it's more like a breeze. You don't chase it, you feel it when you're still." They planted for a while without speaking. Then the traveler asked, "Have you always lived this way?" "No," the old man said. "I used to chase too. I ran in circles until the dust I kicked up looked like progress." The traveler laughed. "And what changed?" The old man stood brushing soil from his hands. "I got tired of being almost home." The traveler nodded slowly, eyes glistening. He understood, not with his mind, but with the quiet, grounded place inside him that no longer needed proof. That evening, he unpacked his satchel, pulled out the old journals, the scrolls, the notes he had carried for decades. One by one, he placed them in the fire, not in anger, not in loss, but in gratitude. Each page curled, blackened, turned to ash, and in the flicker of the flames he felt what he had searched for all along. Not a truth to hold, but a life to live. Nothing to chase, nothing to become. Only this, the wind, the fig tree, the path beneath his feet, and the great quiet freedom of finally arriving at.
If you're hearing this, thank you for staying with us until the very end. The collection of stories you just heard is not a guide to meditation. It's not a spiritual manual nor a set of moral lessons. It is a mirror, not for you to hold up to others, but to yourself. Each story doesn't tell you how to live. It simply sits beside you like an old friend and asks softly, "What are you carrying in your heart? Is there something you forgot to say?" If at any point your heart felt just a little more still, if even for one moment your breath softened, then maybe, just maybe, a fragment of these stories touched something quiet in you. We call this project The Long Night, because eventually everyone will have one. A night you cannot sleep. A night when you no longer know what to trust. A night that is very still and very real. When those nights come, if you need someone to sit beside you for a while, just know this: there will always be a small light waiting here. We don't promise to bring the dawn, only that we won't turn off the lamp. Sleep well. You've come a long way.